And President Trump not the only person taking heat for causing the mob to go after members of Congress they don't agree with. Texas Senator Ted Cruz also getting a fair amount of the blame, along with some other Texas lawmakers in a lesser role. Our Mariah Gallegos looks into that for us tonight.
It's no surprise that several Texas Republican leaders continued to support President Trump in his drive to overturn the election. This even after rioters stormed the Capitol. 17 out of 25 Texans in Congress still objected to counting Electoral College votes for President-elect Joe Biden. Senator Ted Cruz, one of the Republicans who continued forward in claims of voter fraud, is now receiving backlash.
I think the president's rhetoric was irresponsible. I think it was reckless, and I don't think it was remotely helpful.
Cruz responding to Trump and the rioters, denouncing their actions on Twitter, but some feel it was a little too late. Houstonians gathered and protested earlier today in front of his office, calling for his resignation. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner also saying Texans should hold Cruz accountable. Texans are also calling on the state legislature to hold Attorney General Ken Paxton responsible after he too rallied Trump supporters at a March to Save America speech. Paxton tweeted earlier today saying peaceful protests are constitutional, violent protests are not, but many responded saying he incited the riot. Meanwhile, a few other Texans, like Republican Representative Pat Fallon, are being recognized for joining in with others to safeguard the door to the Capitol chamber. That is, until there were reports of shots fired. All were escorted out after. As the nation moves forward in preparing to inaugurate Joe Biden as president, Texans continue to call for action against these two prominent state leaders. Some of those call to actions include the resignation of Senator Ted Cruz, and for the legislature to limit, restrict, or even impeach Attorney General Ken Paxton. Mariah Gallegos, 3 News.